Alrighty. Okay, there we go. Everything is up and running. Okay. Alrighty. Where am I? Who am I? What am I doing? Okay. Woo, loud. Too loud. Drop my pen. All right, so welcome back, everybody. It's Thursday. Okay, so we're gonna get started here and kind of pick up where we left off last time. So last time we finished up talking about our, how religion works according to Smith, and specifically going through those 10 causal mechanisms that he puts forward, right? So we started into the next section, and we'll see where we end up. Usually, this is the last section of the course before the first midterm. Maybe that I'm moving a bit faster through it this time. I'm not sure. So this is a pretty long unit, right? If I look at how many slides I have, it's quite a few, so this may take a while, 50. Okay, so this could take a bit, but typically this is the last one before the midterm. We still have a fair bit of space before the midterm, so we will see, and we'll keep you up to date as we go. Okay, so we were talking last time about some of our kind of classic theories of religion that are found in the sociology of religion, right? And we started off, as we always must, with, one of the big three kind of founders of sociology as a discipline, Karl Marx, right? And conflict theory, specifically, looking at his view of religion. As we kind of said earlier in the course, right? When we talk about Marx, his view of religion is overwhelmingly negative, right? He's a social constructionist, right? He thinks that religion emerges entirely from the social context. Basically, religion is a reflection of the pre-existing social conditions that pervade in a society, and so it reflects the people of that society, right? And to put it very bluntly, in Marxist terms, man makes religion. Religion doesn't make man, right? So it's a reflection of, a wish-fulfilling fantasy. We'll talk Freud in a sec. That's more Freudian language when it comes to religion than Marxist, but it's the same kind of idea, right? And again, for Marx, the principal purpose of religion was to basically do two things: uphold the social system through divinized rules, right? Through making the rules of the society seem like they came from God, and giving a sort of release valve for the people that suffered in these societies, giving them hope for something in the future, in the afterlife, right? If you follow all the rules and you live your good Christian or Jewish or Muslim or whatever life, but mostly he's thinking Christianity, right? So Marxist thoughts are very focused on a Christian kind of religious conception. But you live out your life following the rules, you go to heaven, and so he thinks it's like a drug, right? It drugs people into accepting the conditions of the present. Oops, I did not want to do that. Hang on, I want to do this so I can see what time it is. There we go. Right, so accepting the conditions that they're in with the promise of something better to come, right? And yeah, he thinks ultimately that religion is doomed to fade away, right? We'll talk about secularization theory later. That's our next unit after we talk about theories of religion. We talk about theories of secularization, which are a separate kind of category. But you could put Marx very much into a classical secularization theory, which basically suggests that given given modernity, right, and the coming of modern life, what you're ultimately going to get slowly is the death of religion, right? That religion and modernity are incompatible, right? And I think this is going to be especially the case once we move past capitalism, right? Once we get through capitalism, there will be no place for religion in a socialist utopia, right? Because everything that it provides, right, it's compensation for the material deprivation that the masses live today will make religion irrelevant, right? So he thinks religion is doomed to the dustbin of history. All right. So the next of the big three is Emile Durkheim, right? So again, you've all taken SOC 100, so you all probably have a sense of who Emile Durkheim is. Durkheim has quite a fascination with religion. He talks in the kind of work he does on suicide, he talks about it extensively, right, and looks at the role of religion in either preventing or mitigating, the conditions that lead to suicide. But probably the thing that he's most remembered for in terms of theories of religion is, the whole book that he wrote on it, Elementary Forms of Religious Life. Now, Durkheim, in writing the Elementary Forms of Religious Life, is doing what a lot of scholars at this period were trying to do, which essentially is trying to trace back the origins of religion to kind of their social roots. So in this period, right, one of the things that happens with someone like Durkheim is he wants to look at what he considers much more primitive societies, right, to see what their form of religion is like, so that he can kind of get back to what the origins of religion were before it accumulated all of the sort of institutions, symbols, complex theologies, that would come with more kind of structured and organized forms of religion, right? Now, Durkheim doesn't actually go and do any research, right? Durkheim, you could say that a lot of this is, armchair sociology. I can't remember where Durkheim was when he wrote Elementary Forms of Religious Life. I'm sure someone could tell me. But basically what he does is he looks at a bunch of ethnographic and anthropological data that's coming out of, kind of not the early days of anthropology, but yeah, I guess in a lot of ways the early days of anthropology, specifically ethnographic data about the Arunta people of Australia, right? So these are indigenous people of Australia. And again, this is this sort of quest to find people that Durkheim considers are closer to that state of nature, in a sense, than modern, say, Christians or Muslims would be, right? So he's trying to find, what were the origins of religion, and what from the origins of religion can we then say about religion as a system altogether? Okay, so he uses the data from the Arunta people to make some really broad claims about the origins of religion and the purposes of religious belief and rituals. I think it's important to say here, Durkheim, like Marx and like Weber, is an atheist, right? He's a metaphysical naturalist, right? And very much a materialist, right? So he doesn't believe that there's anything behind religion at all. He doesn't believe in God or gods or deities or spirits or any of that stuff. He believes the natural world is the natural world and nothing else exists. And so for him, right, religion is an inherently social activity, and he treats it as such in all of his kind of work on religion. So what is religion for him, right? Well, it's a key part in the production of social order, right? I wonder if I have that chart forward when I talk about Parsons. I'm just going to go forward for 1 sec. Yes, okay. We'll come back to this chart, right? But and I'll just point to it here really quickly. as a functionalist, right? One of the things, and he wouldn't have called himself functionalist, but the school that comes out of Durkheim is functionalism, right? He views religion as part of the social structures that help constitute a social order, right? So it has a particular set of roles and things that it does in society. Now, Parsons will take this a little bit further. I'm going to zip back to Durkheim, but keep that in mind when we're talking about our good buddy Emil. And oh, I saw a question. Let me go. How do Marxists explain mass conversions? If religions arise from specific social contexts, wouldn't every society have a religion evolve out of it? Yeah, I mean, so that is a really good question. I would say on the whole, religious change for Marxists probably comes out of material change, right? So if anything, say the rise of Christianity for a Marxist would largely come out of changing relations of production and changing kind of social structures. That's the only real way that Marxists can sort of conceive of it, right? Is that, yeah, when a society has some kind of fundamental change, and because Marxists are, I'm forgetting the term now, historical materialists, right? If you're out early, can you get out early today? No, I'll just talk slower and use more words to describe the same thing. Oh, no, we'll see where we're getting at. I didn't even look that carefully at the schedule, so this section takes a while. Anyway, you're silly. Oh, silly creatures, get out early. How will I boost my ego if I don't have an audience forced to listen to me? Oh. Okay, sorry, I was talking about Marxists. Yeah, the only way Marxists can really conceive of social change in a lot of cases, because it's, okay, should I nuance this? I don't want to nuance this too much. If we talk about like classical Marxists, when we talk about, say, like postmodernist or reconstructed Marxists, it's a little different, but let's stick with classical Marxists just for the purposes of this question. The only way you can get social change is if you have changes in kind of material conditions, specifically around the economy, right? They're economic determinists at their core. And so for Marxists, you're going to get new religions and possibly mass conversions to new religious systems when your social systems, right, and especially economic systems start to change. So this, I think, largely, potentially could be useful in explaining, say, the rise of Christianity, right? The Roman system, as Christianity is rising, is sort of cracking apart, right? You have, increasing pressure on the Roman frontiers from Germanic tribes and other, quote unquote, barbarians. That's putting pressure on the Roman economic system. And out of that economic chaos, you would get the emergence of, say, Christianity as the dominant religion. You could make sense of Islam this way as well. And I'm just spitballing. I haven't read any Marxist analysis of the rise of Islam. But Islam sort of, and again, you can read about this in not Spider-Man Tom Holland's book, In the Shadow of the Sword, right, which is about the rise of Islam. It kind of comes at a moment where there's a bunch of economic conditions that are changing. The Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire is starting to kind of collapse under, it's 1,000 years. At that point, no. So it's about 300 years after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, but it's starting to kind of shake apart. It's been hit by plagues and constant wars with Persia. Persia's having the same problems, right? Plagues and constant war with the Byzantine Empire. And so Islam kind of comes into that void, and there's a kind of destabilization of the economic system, which allows a new religious form to kind of pour in and make sense, right? I think that would be a largely Marxist explanation. I'm doing a really quick hit on that, obviously. But yeah, I think for Marxists, that is the only way you can sort of tease out mass conversion, right? Is an old religious form no longer suits the systems of a society, and so the society moves on to a new religious form. Hopefully that made sense. I'm not a Marxist, and I refuse to be one. So I can play one on TV, though, pretty well. Like I said, I've spent a lot of time with Uncle Carl, so I think I understand him pretty well. And all of his silly acolytes. My favorite one being Louis Althusser, for reasons that don't need explaining. Certainly not because he went crazy and murdered his wife. Also, because as the best Marxist, he admitted, I never read Marx all that carefully, which I always think is great. It's like, yeah, I'm a Marxist, but Marx is kind of boring, so I didn't actually bother to read him, but this is my Marxist theory, which I think is the greatest explanation ever. I should like to do this myself. I've not read Foucault, but here is my Foucauldian analysis. I think it's like what 90% of scholars do. I, however, was forced by my very bad PhD supervisor to read all of Foucault, a trauma which I share with my students to this day. Okay, so what does religion do, right? So it produces social order, right? Or it plays a part in the production of social order along with this constellation of other key institutions. And largely what it does for Durkheim is it gives you agreed upon values and norms, right? And it sort of standardizes the norms and values of society through a religious system, right? And it grounds it in the supernatural in a way to make it seem like incredibly real and all of that fun stuff. It ritualizes experience as well for Durkheim, right? It gives people kind of rituals to go back to, kind of a pattern of life that they can move through that's particularly normalized, right? So on Sundays you do this, on this day, on December 25th, you celebrate Christmas, on whatever day Easter's on, because Easter moves around. You celebrate Easter, and there's on the feast of Saint Swithin, you celebrate Saint Swithin's Day, and all of that, actually a saint, I can't remember, I want to say it's like July 14th. Don't ask me why I know that. It's like a running joke in my family, because we always say, that won't happen until Saint Swithin's, and we can never remember when Saint Swithin's is, so it can happen whenever we want. We'll get a switch 2 on Saint Swithin's. There we go. Anyway, right? It gives a structure to life. Okay, and it creates what he calls moments of collective effervescence, which are these moments of kind of shared cultural engagement where people feel heightened emotions together, right? So you go to you go to church or you go to a revival service or something, you sing merry songs of Jesus or whatever, and you all feel this kind of religious sentiment all at the same time, right? And you all feel bonded by that shared experience of effervescence is like the bubbles in soda. So you feel the shared bubbliness of religion, right? And that shared experience. Okay, so yeah, those participating in religion, this is an analysis of Durkheim's philosophy, right, or ideas, feel a bond of community and unity and feel morally strengthened, right? And that's largely what religion is meant to do. It bonds groups together, right? You feel like because you all share the same religious rituals, you're all together, and especially when, external threats come, that allows you to bond together even more closely, especially if that person happens to have a different religion, right? Now, again, for Durkheim, this is all just a bunch of psychological states that we basically generate in our interactions with each other and institutions, right? So there's no there for Durkheim. There's no God there generating any of this. It's just we all go to a prayer meeting, and because we're all there together, we all feel stuff, right? And one person starts praying out loud, and then you feel something, and then boom, 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 right? It all comes together. Then we feel closely bonded, and it all kind of rolls from there. Okay, so yeah, all of those aspects of religion are products of society. They are not products of a supernatural. Okay. Oh yes, sorry, I have that there. I just wanted to make sure I had that. And sometimes I wonder if things are just in my head. I'm I know this concept and I should talk about it, but sometimes I don't know if they're in the slides or just in my brain. So I had to make sure. All right, so Durkheim on religious change, right? Largely, Durkheim, like Marx and like Weber, who we'll talk about in a sec, is a materialist, right? And he's an atheist, doesn't believe there's anything there. And he shares this kind of basic belief with sort of I suppose you would say, the enlightened people of the day, and a belief very much going back to the Enlightenment, right? So in the 18th century, that religion ultimately was fading, right? So he believed that religion was in retreat and traditional forms of religion were in decline. And like all of his, everyone from the Enlightenment forward, he thinks the culprit here is modernity, right? Grumpy. Super grumpy. There we go. Modernity. Right? So modernity. That is the culprit, right? So as the world gets more modern, and especially as it embraces science and reason, there's less and less place for religion, right? So religion is going to disappear, right? And it's going, because its social purpose is being superseded by other things. And as it retreated, right, he said it would be replaced by the cult of the individual, right? And sort of the sentiment, I have Yoda's head here. He basically believed at the end of the day that religion would be replaced by a society that instead of worshiping a deity, ultimately kind of worshipped itself, right? So it becomes sort of self-referential. Now, Durkheim, as opposed to, I would say, Marx certainly thinks that this would be a good thing. I think Durkheim sees this fundamentally as a problem, right? That ultimately, religion being replaced by a cult of the individual or by a society that self-referentially worships itself is ultimately a society that is headed down a fairly negative path, right? One that doesn't have kind of core values. And I'm sure you've heard this term from Durkheim or functionalists before. The concern here is anomie, right? This idea that disconnected from these widely shared norms, values, and roles that people, would play in society, that people would get disconnected and lose their sense of self and their sense of purpose and drift into a sort of nihilism, right? Or a sense of they don't know what to do. And disconnected individuals are a problem for society because they're not well integrated. So, he's concerned about things like anomie. Okay, so he compares what we're kind of going into at that time, or what he thinks the world is moving towards, to the medieval village, right? And he says the medieval village or medieval society was largely oriented towards the collective, right? And the survival of the group or village and its ability to perpetuate itself into the future, right? So they were worried about things like the common good rather than the good of the individual or individual rights. Now, all of this he thinks, and like Marx, right? Marx, Weber, Durkheim, they're all writing at slightly different periods. Durkheim and Weber a little later than Marx, and so they're correcting Marx in some ways. But they all see the disruption that capitalism was causing to European and to a lesser extent American society, essentially because it's upending social norms. It's breaking down, say, the medieval village or medieval life and forcing it into a modernist role, right? So, where people used to see themselves, less as individuals and more as part of a whole, that starts to reverse in modernity because those bonds between people start to break down. Now, for Durkheim, what he thinks is, eventually this has to be replaced by things like a respect for dignity and rights of the individual to replace religious beliefs, right? And so you can hear the kind of echoes of the Enlightenment in there, right? And you hear that kind of statement out of the American Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, and from that equal creation they derive rights such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? That kind of natural law sort of articulation of things, but for Durkheim you'd have to strip it even of references to the creator, but some kind of notion of dignity and rights has to step into the space left vacant by religion. And if individualism were left unchecked, what you get is the Kardashians and the whole society breaks down. I'm only half joking about that. Everybody for themselves or everybody making a TikTok, who knows? That's what it is. Okay, so some flaws in Durkheim. So Durkheim has there's a lot of critics of Durkheim not the least of which is my personal spirit animal, Rodney Stark, I was just reading Stark again the other day. What was it in? Religion, Deviance, and Social Norms. Or I can't remember if that's the title. But he will just take a pot shot at Durkheim for no reason. And I'm like, yeah, I'm good with it. At my heart, I think I'm more of a functionalist than anything else. But I'm okay with pot shots at Durkheim nevertheless. Okay. So this is your sort of Durkheimian way of phrasing things. Religion is an interdependent system of beliefs and practices regarding things which are sacred, that is to say, set apart and forbidden, beliefs and practices which unite all those who follow them into a single moral community called a church. All right, so this is our traditional kind of Durkheimian definition. And things that are sacred are generally held up against things that are profane, right? Now, one of the real critiques, I think, of Durkheim is Durkheim will say things like this, and he'll throw out kind of a sentence similar to this, right, and talk about the sacred and the profane, but the best definition he gives us of the sacred is things set apart, forbidden beliefs and practices, right, which unite blah, 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 into a moral community called the church. It's not a really strong definition of what is sacred, right? There's no real judgment criteria with which to judge certain things sacred and certain things as profane. That's really clear, right? And again, one of the things that you can easily critique Durkheim for here is, would a lot of people think the American flag you shouldn't be allowed to burn the American flag. So in that definition, is the American flag sacred, right? Or the Declaration of Independence, right? Or the Founding Fathers and their vision. Like the number of times I hear American political commentators say something like, the vision of the founders was, and I'm like, pardon my language, who gives a shit? They're dead, they're long dead, and why should their, conception of how everything should run be the only one we can make reference to? Because I'm just like, I know we've stumbled into the realm of something that's held up as sort of sacred or unchangeable for some people, right? Other people are like me, and it's like, okay, let's change some stuff. Woo! Specifically, you have to throw the woo in there or it doesn't work. It's a pretty weak definition, and the definition of the profane is those things that are, not set apart, forbidden, and they're things of the everyday world. It gets really messy, and Stark, I know in his book Why God, critiques Durkheim for this specifically, and is like, we don't have great definitions of the sacred and the profane. We're just sort of meant to figure out, I think this is sacred and this is profane. There's no really strong categories, right? So he doesn't really try to define what's sacred and what's profane in really useful ways. So it's really, really problematic, right? Okay, now also, because Durkheim doesn't believe that there's anything supernatural in the universe, right, which fair enough, this is sort of sociology's outlook in general, but he doesn't ever really include any idea of the supernatural, or what we would call superhuman powers, because, Smith is correcting this largely in his definition, into his definition, right? Now he does this, whoa, the screens are bouncing. The students above have been released. I don't know why it does that. I'm assuming it's because people are walking around upstairs. Freedom. Someone play the bagpipes. There you go. Yeah, so he thinks primitive religions lack any belief in superhuman powers, right? And he believed that, for instance, that Buddhism generally lacked reference to the supernatural, which is not true, right? Buddhism has many forms, but many forms of Buddhism do in fact have a really, we'll posit a god, right? Or, some form of Brahman, kind of because it draws from Hinduism. Other forms are a little bit less clear, but they all have some sense that there is some sort of superhuman power, some kind of force that you're trying to align with to escape from the cycle of rebirth and suffering and all of that jazz, right? So he misunderstood, Buddhism and other what he terms primitive religions, which he thought didn't have a conception of the supernatural. Now again, largely why does he make this mistake? well, I don't want to criticize him too much for this, but he's European, right? He's a white dude. But mostly he comes out of a, Christian. We're going to shorten Christian to X-I-A-N. He's out of a Christian culture, right? And so his conception is that the only kind of superhuman power or supernatural that's worth talking about really is things like God or, the Greek and Roman gods, Egyptian gods, things that he's familiar with from that European context, right? So he makes this kind of mistake of being like, well, this looks really different in Buddhism, so obviously they don't believe in the supernatural, and he just makes a mistake, right? And again, he's doing this from his armchair, in, I want to say he's in Switzerland, so he's not deeply engaged with practitioners. He's probably never met a Buddhist, right? So that doesn't really help. Durkheim sounds clairvoyant. If Martin called religion a coping mechanism for suffering people, does this mean he did believe to an extent that religion has a place in society? Yes, but a bad one, right? Like for Marx, this opium of the people, as it is, basically it keeps people from realizing, their class consciousness, right? It keeps them from realizing how bad the world is. It numbs them to the pain of this world, and if they weren't, right, they would murder the bourgeoisie, which is what Marx wants them to do, right? So, I get it. Sometimes the bourgeoisie is annoying, right? Billionaires, especially now, they're kind of irritating. So, I feel him. So it has a place in society. He doesn't believe it's a good place, right? He thinks it largely serves the elites by keeping the people passive, right? Thoughts on the ACP? I'm not cluing in on what that acronym means. Give me the meaning of the acronym and I might have a better sense. Okay, so if there's no higher power for Durkheim, who does he assume people are praying to? No one, right? He doesn't think they're praying to anyone. He thinks it's just a psychological state, right, that we fall into. It helps us do things. It helps us share norms and values, right? But you praying and you talking into an empty room are basically the same, right? I guess you can pray by talking into an empty room, so that's a terrible example. But he doesn't think there's anything there. He thinks all of the effects of religion, right, are, they come out of social norms, and they ultimately are there to reinforce our own beliefs about the world, social structures, but there's nothing there that you're praying to. Any effects you feel is just your psychological kind of state that you're put into, and that collective effervescence, and those kind of feelings of unity that come, from all of that. Okay. So, okay. Thoughts on the American Communist Party? So my thought is I've never heard of these people. So I have no thoughts on them. I will do research and try to form an opinion. Most self-proclaimed communists aren't real communists. Yes, let's not get into that debate. That is a story. Shall we say, a horse of a different color. Durkheim sounds clairvoyant. We shall see. All right. Would it be fair to assume then that Durkheim was looking at religion from a Eurocentric view? 100%. And to be fair, for a good part of the history of this discipline, right, which is why when someone asked me, at the beginning of the course, is like, are we going to talk about Eastern perspectives? The discipline is still broadly shaped by European assumptions, right? It's been really, really hard for students of religion to move outside of those European assumptions, right? And like I said, even one of our very core principles, right, our very core questions is the world becoming more secular, is ultimately a very Western and Eurocentric question that doesn't make sense in a lot of other societies, right? So, would it be fair to assume that he's looking at it from a very Eurocentric view? Yes. And I'm sorry to say this, but sociology in a lot of ways is a very Eurocentric discipline. It sees its founding comes from a bunch of white European dudes that saw things from a very white European dude perspective, and it still carries a lot of that baggage with it. And it's really hard to get rid of that because its philosophical assumptions are very much out of Europe. In summary, I don't know why my son is texting me again. It's in his calendar that says, don't phone dad, don't text dad during this time. I hate early dismissal in Catholic schools. It annoys me to no end. Okay, would it be fair to, okay, yes, I answered you. In summary, Marx thought religion had a bad place. Durkheim thought religion had a somewhat good place. Yes. I mean, I think he saw it, let's maybe take the moral language out of Durkheim. He thought it was useful, right? It served an important social function. And his concern is, if it's no longer serving that function because it's fading away, what happens to people, right? It has to be replaced by something else, or society is going to fall into some broader dysfunction, right? I think that's the more proper way of putting it in Durkheim's view, right? It has a social function. And if it's not doing it, well, you know, there could be trouble. Oh, do I have to talk about Max? Okay, I do. I like him almost as much as I like Freud at this point. We'll talk about Freud too. So, Weber. Oh, Max Weber. So, Weber's probably best known in terms of source of religion for this book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, right? And if you've ever taken, I think it's SOS 225 with Richard Westerman. Richard's a good guy. I like Richard a lot. But he makes you read at least part of The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And I, you know, though we haven't talked about it, I try to send messages through students to Richard, telling him to please stop. Because it's a bad book. Okay, what is Weber's kind of contribution when we talk about religion? So, largely, you know, where someone like Marx, and Durkheim to some extent as well, consider religion really as a form, or as an institution or a social structure that leads to social stability. One of the things that Weber really stresses in the Protestant Ethic is this notion that religion actually is amongst the many institutions that can also contribute to social change. Now, I mean, if we kept the point that broad, I would mostly agree with Weber on that point. I'll tell you why I don't agree with Weber in a second. But yeah, he makes a connection between the rise of capitalism, right? And I'll show you a little video that summarizes this. If you've taken SOS 100 with me, you'll have seen it already. Between the rise of capitalism and what he calls the Protestant ethic, right? Specifically a kind of Protestant work ethic. But I'll explain it in a bit of detail here. So the meanings that people attach to a bunch of religious ideas, such as the need to prove intense worldly activity through displays of industry, punctuality, frugality in everyday life, as a sign that they are, you know, saved and going to heaven, right? So he thinks that, anyway, let me play the video and I'll then unpack it from there. Is the audio on? It looks like it is.
Those who pursue religion often turn away from worldly affairs. They're suspicious of wealth and business, preferring an ascetic life of contemplation and prayer. The sociologist and economist Max Weber argued that after the Reformation, one form of Christian Protestantism, Calvinism, encouraged a different attitude to work, with far-reaching effects. Calvinists believed in predestination. A precise number of souls would go to heaven. The lucky ones had places reserved by God. However, most Calvinists were terrified there would be no seat awaiting them in paradise. They were always on the lookout for signs that they had been saved. One clear indication that they were on the guest list was that they were actively contributing to their community through their work. In his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber argued that the Calvinists' need to reassure themselves through their industry was an important factor in the growth of capitalism in Northern Europe. They built up businesses that generated wealth, but at the same time lived thrifty lives. They reinvested any surplus and so helped fuel capitalism. Eventually, capitalism would have a life and momentum of its own. But according to Weber at least, its initial impetus came from a theological source.
Okay, hang on. I'm gonna do something here. I'm making an extra slide because I know that's what you all want. More slides. I heard that. I didn't actually. I heard a sound, and I thought I'd threaten you with a good time. Okay, so I'm going to explain something really quickly. All right, so Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. PESC, if you will. So this is often held up as a classic of sociology, and people still go back to it and read it and offer like the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism as a plausible explanation for the emergence of capitalism, right? And you might hear, grad students or undergrads throwing this around, and you really should stop. And I'll tell you why. Okay, so Weber's really concerned with, the emergence of capitalism in two places. Yellow's not going to work, is it? So the Netherlands and England, right? And both of these places, right, when you get to kind of early forms of capitalism, especially the Industrial Revolution, they're both Protestant, right? The Netherlands is largely Calvinist, and this is what he focuses on. And England has moved to Anglicanism. But one of the early advisors to Henry VIII was the founder of Calvinism, John Calvin, despite the fact that Calvinist theology doesn't really have that much impact on Anglican theology. Weber sort of brushes this part over, probably because he doesn't really understand it, to be honest. Okay, so what's wrong with the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, right? So I guess what's good is it does link religion as a possible agent of social change, right? So it says that, for Calvinists, they believed in predestination, right? So they essentially believed, hang on, I have to back up half a step. They're moving away from Catholicism, right? And Catholicism has a particular kind of theology of how you get to heaven, and that's essentially through the church, right? So for Roman Catholicism, right, salvation comes through the church and specifically through the sacraments, right? So you go to confession, you get communion, you get last rites if you're dying, and all of these things are what assures you of salvation, right? That you're going to be saved, you're going to go to heaven. Okay, so you just have to do all the things. For, a lot of historical reasons, a lot of theological reasons, the Protestant reformers largely reject this, right? So our Protestants reject what they call works, right? So you can't earn your way into heaven by doing good things or by taking your sacraments or any of those things, right? It's salvation through faith alone, by grace alone, is the soli fide soli gratia in the kind of Protestant language. So this leaves a sort of a problem, right? How do you know if you're saved? Right? You don't. It becomes really complicated. And added to this, John Calvin, who's, whatever you want to think of him, he has this other idea that because God is omniscient, right, God knows from the beginning whether you are saved or not. So your actions actually sort of play no part in it whatsoever, right? Either you're going to heaven or you're going to hell, and God knew it before you ever showed up on this earth, right? He knew it from the first moment of the universe. And so, this becomes another kind of big problem. So what they've done, right, and for Weber, is by redefining salvation, right, around, it's done by faith alone, right? You only get it because you believe in God and Jesus and all that jazz. And through grace alone, it's only because God gives you salvation out of the goodness of his whatever. Not a heart. Well, heart would, if we're anthropomorphizing God, then sure. Right? But you don't do anything to earn it. And then God knows if you're saved or not from the beginning. So are you one of what they call the elect, right? The ones that God has chosen to be saved or not? And this becomes a kind of psychological problem because people really start to worry about this, right? It's like, oh my gosh, am I on the list? How big is the list? How many people are on the list? Am I on the guest list? And so for Weber, a class of people, specifically in these Calvin-influenced lands, starts to worry about this. And one of the ways they soothe that worry is by living simple lives, right? So they're like, well, I'm going to live in the Christian way, which is, relative simplicity, what he calls asceticism, right? Living simply. And then as they get richer, and, they have a pretty rich merchant class, they reinvest all of the money they're not spending because they're living pretty simply into their businesses, which is that fuel oil that gets capitalism going. And that's where that Protestant ethic, right, the work ethic, working hard, saving money, reinvesting it in your business to show that, you've been blessed by God and you're living a good Christian life, so you must be one of the elect, fuels capitalism. And this is a really, really nice theory, all bundled up, explains everything, with one ever so slight problem. It's completely wrong. So this is a point that again, Rodney Stark makes, and Stark is no great fan of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. He refers to it, and I'm paraphrasing this quote a little bit, but I believe he referred to it as a book so stupid only sociologists would bother to read it. He's a sociologist, so I don't know what that says. The biggest problem is, and here, let me clear off my doodles and I'll tell you what it is. So very much like Marx, Weber is a bad historian. Marx is an awful historian, by the way. So never read a Marxist history from Marx or Engels and assume that it has any basis in fact. So, and here, if you want a book-length treatise on much of this, you can read Stark's Why the West Won, which is a really interesting sort of book. I tried to read it to my son as a bedtime story when he was like 7, and he didn't like it. I don't know why. It was always open on my Kindle, and I was reading books to him, so I would start reading How the West Won. And then he's like, no, and then we would end up reading like the Wings of Fire series or something. But I would always start by reading sections out of Why the West Won. So it's still kind of a running joke between the two of us. It's a perfect children's book. You should read it. No, but in How the West Won, he largely makes the point that this history makes sense unless you ignore everything that or if you ignore everything that happened before. And largely the big problem is that Weber sort of assumes that capitalism sort of kicks off in the Netherlands and England, and that they sort of invent the whole thing. But what Stark points out is that you essentially have, proto-cap. Oh wait, so there's one more thing I should mention about the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. One of the things that Weber is trying to figure out is why Protestant countries, and especially, right, like the Netherlands and England, economically outperform Catholic countries like France, Italy, parts of Germany, right, and Spain and Portugal and those. And so he's like, oh, it must be because of this Protestant ethic, and that allowed them to kickstart capitalism faster. What you have, though, in a lot of Catholic places is forms of proto-capitalism going back, like, arguably to the 7th century, right, to the 600s. Where you get, things like, and again, just to give you the quick hits, things that become essential to capitalism really getting started, like double entry bookkeeping, credit, a banking system, right, where instead of transporting around chests of gold, it's like, I'm going to loan the king 8 million shekel, or crowns, let's say, and instead of carrying 8 million crowns in a chest, which can easily be stolen by bandits, you carry a little piece of paper that says, hey, we here in this bank in Milan are loaning you, the King of France, 8 million crowns, right? That whole system is invented mostly in Italian city-states long before, and then like systems of proto-capitalism, spring up on medieval monastic estates where they come up with these really sophisticated industries where like the Trappist monks in France make beer, right? And they make really good beer. and then they trade that beer for money, which they then use to buy all the non-beer things that monks need to live, right? And different monasteries do different things. There are cheese monasteries and cow monasteries, and they produce all sorts of things. And all of these proto-capitalistic industries exist long before the Protestant ethic, long before, you know, the Industrial Revolution and capitalism, and they lay the seedbed for it. So what Stark says is, you know, Weber's getting this history wrong. He's assuming that Protestantism sort of coincides with the, you know, emergence of capitalism, but actually capitalism has been emerging slowly in European society for centuries. It just happens to pick up, say, in England, not because of Calvinist theology, but because they're isolated, right? So they don't get invaded much. They have really good sheep. I don't know, that's a thing. Apparently British or English wool is highly prized in medieval society because their sheep is better or something. And, you know, because they don't get invaded every 3 minutes, like a lot of the continental countries, you know, they get to develop kind of in a more peaceful way. So Weber's wrong, and like Marx, he's a really terrible historian. And, you know, if anyone wants to fight me on this, specifically British professors that teach theory, I'm happy to go to the mat on this one. Okay, so we should disregard Weber in that respect. And I know I've told you now too much about Weber and internecine sociology of religion fights, but isn't that why you're all here? Are you not entertained? You might not be, I don't know. You know, it's ultimately source of religion at the end of the day. Okay, so one more thing on my buddy Max Weber, who clearly I don't like that much. But there's good things about Weber. I just don't think Protestant ethic is one of them. Okay, Weber, you know, ultimately believed that capitalism and modernity would lead institution is going to tilt away from, you know, superstition towards efficiency and doing things the most rationalized and efficient way. And how that pertains to religion is he thought this would ultimately lead to a process of what he called disenchantment, right? So what he says, you know, and you can find this in modern philosophers like Charles Taylor, right? The American philosopher, or is he British? I think I'm going to say he's American, and you know, maybe I'm wrong. Charles Taylor, who wrote a book called now I'm forgetting the name of the book. The kind of term that jumped into mind with Taylor is he talks about the buffered self, right? Where basically we don't, I talked to you about this before, we don't believe that there's spirits that really influence us. Most of us don't anyway, right? We think we are, you know, a ghost in a shell or just a shell. I don't know which. Depends on your worldview, right? But there's not other ghosts coming in to affect you in particular ways. But pre-modern people thought that, you know, the world was full of spirits and superhuman powers that controlled the weather and, you know, your health and all sorts of things, right? Now, so they thought there, and, you know, we still have what you might call pre-modern societies today, and you can still find these sorts of beliefs in them. What Weber thought, though, is that as modernity crept forward, rationalization would provide us with material explanations for most things, right? You know, not that people ever were like, God is angry, that's why there's thunder. Well, I mean, maybe people did, but that probably wasn't the majority. People understood weather was just a thing. But, you know, things like mental illness being caused by the demonic, right, was certainly a belief that some people held. And now we have materialist explanations for this, right? It's something going on in your brain, a chemical imbalance, right? And, you know, or we understand things like evolution, right? That the appearance of life comes from sort of a set of material causes. And this is kind of in this big process that Weber thinks is going to happen. As we get more and more material explanations for things, as we rationalize the world more, eventually religion just becomes unnecessary, right? And it should disappear, right? We should get rid of religion, which is why there are no more religious people today, right? No, obviously kidding. So he kind of sees this as neutral. It's just like, look, this is clearly what the natural process of things is going to be. Religion will play no role in society because we don't need it anymore, right? So that's sort of where he comes down. Okay, is the new slide going to be on the test? I mean, maybe. I mean, I said a bunch of stuff, so possibly. How long do you have to write? 90 minutes. Maybe a little more if I'm feeling generous. Did I have a good breakfast that day? I don't know. No, I'll tell you all in advance. It's usually 90 minutes though, and that's usually what we got. Okay, is it just that there is not really demand, that people don't want to expand studies outside of heavily Western view, or it's more difficult branching out? Oh, that's a question back to the kind of philosophical roots. So people definitely have, gone out and tried to do sociology of religion in other places, right? It's not universal. I think of it like a lot of the base assumptions of soc of religion are so grounded in a Western mindset that we sort of bring that mindset everywhere we go. And so it gets hard to get outside of your own mindset. We have a long history of sociology of religion that has these sort of assumptions baked in. Okay, clear. How am I doing? Oh, I'm doing so amazingly good. Freud. Okay. So, other kind of classical theories of religion. And here, I include Freud, A, because it's wildly amusing. B, because Freud's view, you see it reflected often in things like conflict theory and kind of critical theories. It sort of blends in with Marxist views in major ways. So while he's not a sociologist, in a lot of ways, Freud's view is pretty influential, and especially on, I would say, sort of the more atheistic materialist side of kind of philosophical discussions. Acknowledged or not, a lot of Freud's views kind of come through. Okay, so Freud, not a fan of religion, by the way, thought it was a great hindrance to society. And he thought, in the same way, you would put him in that kind of class of social constructionists, that it's merely a product of the mind and therefore an illusion. Is there any other way to pronounce illusion than just like long L's and a long U? Illusion, right? So for Freud, fundamentally, religion is a form of wish fulfillment, right? Now, if you want to put this in really crude kind of Freudian terms, why does Christianity, Christianity, Judaism, and I guess Islam, why do they have God as a father, right? Well, it must be because, humanity has a tough time with father figures, right? That fathers are often harsh. They can be abusive. They can be difficult. Sometimes they leave you, because that other woman over there is hotter and he wanted to be with her. So dad has gone away and now you have a shitty relationship with your dad. So what do? Well, we create a nice dad in the sky, right? Why do you find Jasmine finds this wildly amusing? Well, this is Freud. Freud is stupid, right? So you create your nice dad in the sky, right? And that's why this particular form of God exists in Western societies, right? We all have daddy issues, according to Freud, which he clearly does believe, by the way. So it's a form of wish fulfillment, and other things like an omnibenevolent and omnipresent God, right? These are all things that we kind of hope, and that's, putting Jesus in the role of divinity is, again, a form of kind of wish fulfillment for that society. Now, obviously, for Freud, different societies are going to have different wishes, so you're going to have different forms of religion because they fulfill the different kind of psychological wishes that you have in a particular society, right? And what does he say, right? Religion is an illusion, and it derives its strength from the fact that it falls in with our instinctual desires, right? So there's something that we want, we can't get it in the world, so we project it onto a deity, and that's what you get. And yeah, he thinks it is a reversion to childish patterns of thought in response to feelings of helplessness and guilt. And do I have this on the next slide? I do. Fuck, I hate Freud so much. I could just take him out of the course, but he's too amusing. Okay, so this is Freud's theory of where religion comes from. And I mean, I'm compressing it slightly for reasons of brevity, more or less. But not that much, right? So his big theory of religion comes out of a book called Totem and Taboo. And Freud, he's doing the same thing as Durkheim is doing, right? Trying to imagine back to the prehistoric past of human societies to figure out where religion came from, right? And he comes to this conclusion, which, by the way, and I just want to stress this, is based on nothing at all other than Freud thinks so, which is pretty much Freud in a nutshell. It's like everything that he thinks is like, where did you get, which is why, like, honestly, all this crap about id, ego, superego, and the subconscious, like, it's all Freudian bullshit, and you should not believe a word of it. And the subconscious one really bugs me for reasons that I'm about to tell you, because there's absolutely no evidence of any kind that there is a subconscious mind, that there's like a mind inside your mind that's thinking independent thoughts that you're not conscious of. We have sort of unconscious processes going on, right, where you drive home and you don't know how you got there because your body goes into autopilot, but you don't have a subconscious, or at least there's no evidence that there's a mind doing work in the background that you're not aware of at a conscious level. Zero actual evidence of this. But everybody talks about, well, in my subconscious. You don't have a fucking subconscious. I'm sorry. But anyway, I have my gripes with Freud, and I have gripes with how Freud has affected, like, us at a pop culture level. And I will never stop yelling about this to people who will listen, the ones who pay to be here. So anyway, subconscious, I don't think is a real thing. Unconscious, totally different story, but that is a horse of a different color and a story for another time. But it's one of these concepts that Freud makes up, kind of like his idea about religion. His idea about religion. He thinks it comes from a patricide in some primordial human group. Daddy issues. Patricide, killing your dad, right? So this is the story that he tells in Totem and Taboo. Once upon a time, he doesn't use that terminology, but he might as well. There was a tribe, and that tribe had a warrior father. And that warrior leader guy, because he was the warrior leader guy, took all of the hot women and had sex with them. And some of those women had sons. But when they grew up and wanted their own hot women, they discovered the dad was hogging all the hot women. So they killed him. And then they felt bad about it. Right? So I guess I skipped the, sons kill the father out of their jealousy for his access to women. But then none of them can truly take the role of their father, right? They can't emulate him. So they start to fight amongst each other, and they kill each other, and wars spring up. And they create religion from the frustration and guilt they feel. So God is a projection of their unconscious mind, or I should put subconscious mind, because that's the actual Freudian term, and their guilt that they're feeling. So they're like, now we need a God to forgive our sins. And again, this is weirdly Judeo-Christian in its like vision of how divinity is created, because if you think about it for 2 seconds, like Zeus doesn't give a crap about forgiving your sins. He just wants to turn into a swan and also have sex with women. I don't know. Stuff is weird. Right? So this is not a universal definition of gods, but this is honestly what Freud comes up with. And I don't know if half the time I don't know if he's serious or if he's just like trolling us all. And that is what we're going to have forever. Sorry, I'm reading his quote. And we have a Freud fan walking out right now. No, I'm kidding. I'm teasing. Okay, so now I've gotten animated about Freud, and I'll calm down. Yeah, so this is the Freudian vision, but it's especially in this kind of like idea that God is a projection of the unconscious mind, of our unconscious desires, of our daddy issues. That Freud is still influential in some circles, right? Because that kind of thought that it's just a human projection. And we project what we would want a God to be. Not that there's rational thoughts behind it. It's all this irrational unconscious, right? So, religion is comparable to childhood neuroses. It's so infantile, so foreign to reality, right? That for anyone with a friendly attitude to humanity, it's painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never be able to rise above this view of life. He's also kind of a snob, right? I'm so smart, everyone else is so dumb, right? Now, again, like, this is a pejorative or a patronizing and very pejorative view of religion, and it would discount the large number of super intelligent people that believe in God and have believed in God through history. So whatever. Let's leave Freud. Can I explain Freud's theory about the dad issues again? Fine, I can. Do you really want me to? All you can do, if he's just a nutcase, I don't know. Partially it's fun, and partially like it's not that. Yeah, no, we all have our issues. These ideas, though, really, they're still around. That's why Freud is such an irritant to me, right? The ideas are so stupid, and yet we're still stuck with all of them forever, and we'll never get rid of them. Apparently, because we're all, this 19th and early 20th century kind of weirdo that was obsessed with sex, and apparently thought everyone wanted to sleep with their mom and dad, right? We're stuck with his ideas forever because they're at the core of a lot of our traditions. So there you go. Can I explain his theory? No, go back and watch the video. I can't do this anymore. Yes, specifically the murder of their father and the fact that they can't then step into the role of their father because they're less good than their father. Whatever. Let's stop talking. Okay. Why do we continuously talk about Freud? Even nutcases are influential. We still talk about Marx, and he was kind of kooky. Great beard, though. I will say his beard game was A+. Okay, let's move into some more modern stuff, and maybe we can squeeze one more modern thinker in. Although Erica's not here today, so maybe Jasmine, do you want to be the barometer? Are we? That's too big. I've laid too much at your feet. Okay. I won't ask. So now there's no one to tell me whether we should stop. You can blame Erica for not coming. Thanks a lot, Erica. So, Talcott Parsons. So this is a little bit more modern, kind of mid-20th century. Parsons, is one of these Americans who goes off to Europe prior to there being a discipline of sociology in the American Academy, goes and studies in Germany, and then brings back largely functionalist and Durkheimian ideas from Germany. Okay, so as much as we put, say, Durkheim as sort of the grandfather of structural functionalism, in a lot of ways the articulation that you hear of structural functionalism in classes like this today is largely down to a lot of the work of Talcott Parsons. And Talcott, that's interesting. Call him back. Largely down. Why do we get calls during class only? At least people know I'm working. Okay, Talcott Parsons. So he thinks that basically society is made up of a bunch of institutions that all work together to kind of hold society together and keep things functioning smoothly, right? So amongst these things, you have things like family, education, the economy, religion, and then politics, polity or politics, right? All of these provide kind of vital functions, but limited functions that maintain the social order, right? And so for Parson, and he kind of, I think, dials back religion a little bit compared to Durkheim, right? Looking at society a little bit more broadly, he says religion's really important, right? It offers a bunch of things, right? And in this super high quality diagram, things like faith, conformity, morality, and comfort are things that it offers, right? Norms and values, right? Shared morality being really, really critical to a properly functioning society. So for him, it has a vital but somewhat limited function in maintaining the social order, right? So religion it's important. But it's not the be-all and end-all, right? There are other institutions that are still there holding society together. Now, religion, it provides values which form a sort of basis of values consensus, right? So it offers a set of values, and by the sort of the property that most people historically in a society have all belonged to the same religion, right? You get a values consensus, right? Even if you look back at, say, a country like Canada or the United States, where the split, let's say Canada, for instance, where the split historically between Catholic and Protestant was roughly 50-50, right? So about half the population was Catholic, about half the population was Protestant. Historically, still that kind of shared Christian kind of values base was enough to hold that kind of national community together, right? Everybody shared kind of basically common values, so they had a value consensus, right? Now, other institutions will reinforce those values, right? So like the family, right? Religion offers the values, which are then taught by the family, right? So parents will teach their kids the thing they learned through religion, reinforcing those values. It also gets, historically kind of passed into the education system. So schools will teach kind of similar values to what religion taught and all of that fun stuff, right? And then politics will largely be a reflection of that as well, because politics is based on those shared values commitments, right? So, if you have a belief that all people are created equal, you're going to get a sort of democratic system because everybody should get a voice, and so on and so forth, right? So yeah, things like, thou shalt not kill form the basis of laws against murder, which are then enforced by, the police, right? Another institution that's critical in this system, right? Or the military, or whoever's in charge, right? I guess, police would largely fall within that sphere of the polity. So, that is sort of what religion does. It has this place of providing the values, which are then sort of passed on through other institutions, enforced through other institutions, and form the basis of things like laws that are then enforced by, the political sphere, largely through the police and the courts and other organs. I can't explain this in 5 minutes. I know this slide doesn't look like it has a lot on it, but each of these takes a sec. Okay, let's leave it here. Plus, we're burning through, and well, actually, we got some stuff to talk about. All right, so we'll leave it there, and we'll come back next week on Tuesday.